At this point in RethinkConn 2024, we have yet another announcement, and this one is around small constrained systems, and we have a very special guest for this. So hello guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Andrew Gracey, and I am one of the product managers in the Edge BU at our business unit at SUSE. And I have been focusing for the last few years on industrial IoT and manufacturing and retail. Yeah, I've been at SUSE for about 5 years now, and I've actually been using Kubernetes for a little bit over 7, assuming I'm doing my math correctly.
That's a long sentence, isn't it? 7 years.
It
Ouch.
is.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Apparently, I'm a
Oh.
masochist. I just keep on sticking around in the Kubernetes space.
You are a brave soul. Absolutely. Well, back in 2023, less than a year ago, it feels like way longer, SUSE and Synadia, we went off for a bit of an exploration. Out of the exploration led to some software development work. And we've, as the memes go, what have you done? Well, we've created something. And what we've created is a two-node leadership election that, when tied together with K3S, gives us a two-node K3S solution. And yes, it's contentious, and yes, I can hear all of the computer scientists screaming out over the airwaves, don't do a two-node system. Well, we've done it. We've changed the parameters of the problem space and simplified things down a little bit, but very much taking lessons out of the telecom space. And this problem's largely been solved for things like floating IP addresses, first hop redundancy protocols, and reliability. It's been solved for decades, and we've taken some lessons learned. We've created this two-node election engine, so we've taken Raft out of the equation to allow us to have two nodes. And then we've done something else. So we've bound that to K3S, so we can actually underpin K3S now with NATs for multi-node systems, so your 3, 5, 7-node systems. But really importantly, going forwards through 2024, and it's not available yet, but at some point we're going to have a two-node K3S system. So why would any of you want to do that? So Andrew, would you like to go through your details from your planet-sized brain?
For sure, yeah. We have basically, we were listening to a lot of customers in the edge space, and there was a surprising amount of customers that were very adamant on two nodes. And so what we found was that those customers fell into basically 3 camps. There was one camp that they wanted to reuse their existing hardware. They have on-site already 2 nodes that has more of a traditional architecture with the active-passive, and they wanted to be able to start using Kubernetes in that context, but they weren't willing to go through an entire procurement process again, right? Either it's still good hardware, or they just don't have the budget for that at the moment, especially in more price-conscious environments like retail, right? There's also the camp where they have physical constraints on their hardware, right? They might have a very limited amount of space, limited amount of power, cooling, right? Anything like that, where you don't have the actual like physical space. You run up against a wall, quite literally, or you have economic constraints. And that additional 50% cost all of a sudden prices you out of the hardware refresh that you would otherwise be able to do. And that is especially concerning in places where the workload might need more expensive hardware cards, right? Like a GPU, for example, right? Having to have a third GPU, again, really increases the cost. There is typically the question of like, well, why don't you just add a little third witness node, right? And that tends, my answer for that is, well, one, that increases your operational complexity, right? Because now you have to actually manage that third node. You have to make sure that it gets to the site correctly. It's also an extra point of failure, right? Because assuming that the goal is to reduce your cost, well, now you just increase your cost again and increase the complexity of your solution by adding a third different node as opposed to having it be homogeneous. So the risk versus total cost of ownership balance just doesn't really make sense for many of our customers, and that eliminates the value of the project, right? Um, there's also the kind of the question of, well, just run your application in the cloud. I mean, the whole point of Edge is that you have a much tighter control loop at the edge, right? You want to get the compute as close to where the actual data, e.g., the real world, is. And yeah, so moving everything up to the cloud can be problematic. And honestly, we're seeing a lot of companies who did move their entire control loop to the cloud, moving that back down because they're finding out that, well, the cloud fails on occasion, right? It might not be all that often, but it's enough to actually be a concern. And then lastly, there tends to be the question of like, well, couldn't you just run the third node in your control loop, or just move the entire control plane to the cloud? That becomes a problem mostly because of latency, right? There are a lot of edge environments where you're on the downstream side of a 5G or satellite or DSL connection. Actually, is surprisingly not uncommon. And yeah, imagine trying to run Kubernetes over DSL, right? It's not going to happen, right? There's just not enough bandwidth there to make that a reasonable proposition.
Yeah. You're trying to give me nightmares, aren't you? Kubernetes
Right.
over DSL. Why would you do that?
Or satellite.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Well, before we get all kind of depressive about the subject, if people want to know more, if you're excited by this, if you think, hey, I've got a small machine where I want to take advantage of some of the kind of Kubernetes logic, but I don't want the kind of multiple nodes for my highly available solution, what are the next steps right now for SUSE and Synadia?
Yeah, so at this point, we have a demo that you're about to see, and then we will be working on validation and testing because many of the places that actually need this solution are highly regulated. So we need to do our own due diligence and testing and validation, so to make sure that that everything that we've written does what we expect it to. But our expectation is that in the next short time frame, let's say, I don't know, 3 to 6 months, although that's not a promise, I do not know, where you will have a much larger announcement and be able to have this be a generally available option. That said, if it is of interest, come talk to us, either Synadia or SUSE.
Perfect stuff. And thank you so much for joining us for RethinkConn 2024.
Yeah, thank you for
Appreciate
having
it.
me.